Okay, so now that we've gone through most of the portion of the squat, let's take a look at how we should be racking the bar. All right, so if we're looking at a squat, like a back squat, so the rack position's pretty important. So there's different rack positions. Some are recommended as racking the bar high, and then some suggest like racking the bar low. Okay, so kind of keep in mind that where you rack the bar, like if I rack the bar low, if I racked it down here, it's going to be closer to the fulcrum, right? Like I talked about in the last video, the farther the load or the lever arm is away from the fulcrum, then the more stress that's created to the area of the fulcrum. So in our case, we're looking at the fulcrum being at the hip. So the further away, the further forward this bar goes, or the further away this goes from the fulcrum, the more stress is created to my hips and to my lower back. All right, so as we talked about before, that could be a good thing or a not so good thing. Now, if I rack the bar lower, you'll see it gets closer to the fulcrum. So as I squat down, it doesn't go as far. But again, a lot of this is dependent on trunk position, right? So if I can have a bar that's racked low, but if I have an excessive forward lean, well, look at how far forward I'm going, versus if I could rack the bar up high, but keep my trunk up, right? I don't excessively lean forward, so it's kind of a wash with that. Now, the other thing, though, that's even more important than the position, I mean, if you look at the position, if you rack that bar low down here, now I want you to think about something. If I had a heavy load on this bar, then I'm not going to be in a great position to hold this bar. I'm really not. If it's low on I mean, it's not going to be down here when you rack it, but if you got it low here, you're going to have a real problem trying to hold it because you just really don't have a good rack position here. Versus if you rack it up, higher up on the shoulders, right? There's kind of a shelf that's created with the combination of the upper traps and locking in the shoulder blades versus if you have it down below. So you just got to kind of keep that in mind. The other thing you want to think about is if you have a high rack position, you have to think about your neck, your cervical column in particular. So with the cervical column, what we want to be careful of is you don't want to rack that bar on your C7 vertebrae, because if you rack it on that, you can cause a lot of shearing of the cervical spine. So what we're looking at is getting a rack position right around the T1, T2 vertebrae, because when you do that, you've got a couple things. One, you've got a better alignment, so you're at the level of your upper traps and your posterior deltoids, so you've got a better kind of shelf that's created when you rack the bar up there. Also, you've got the vertebrae at T1 is supported by the rib cage, so you have a lot more stability at that level of the vertebrae than you do at the cervical. Okay, so you don't want to be racking it up on the cervical vertebrae because you can cause a lot of damage, particularly if you're using significantly heavier loading as well. So you really want to keep that in mind. Right? So we're looking at when you rack it around T1, T2, right, which should be right around the upper traps and the posterior deltoids. So kind of right around in here is where we're looking at, and that's the rack position that we want to use. All right. So and some of the things I'll run through. That's the rack position, everything. The mistakes with squatting. So just some common mistakes to look for. One, when you're assessing the squat, again, I'm not going to go too much into depth with that because I think there's been volumes that have been written about assessing a squat. I take it that when the knees are collapsing, what that means. When if the hip's jutting out to one side, what's going on. So I'll spare you all the details of that. But some of the common mistakes that we're looking at. So one of them has to do with trunk position. So obviously we want to look at where the trunk's at, right? Wherever your trunk goes, your head's going to go and your hips are going to go. So it's all connected. Right, so we're looking at the trunk, we're looking at the hips, we're looking at a lot of things, but for the most part, if you have, I would even say watch the hips first. rather than just going at all this. Look at the trunk, look at the head, look at this. Watch at the hips first and foremost. So when you got somebody, you're looking at someone do a squat, and the first thing they're going to do is descend into that squat. Watch their hips. Their hips will tell you everything. So if their hips go back, what you want to look at then is look at what follows. So if somebody goes excessively backward on the squat, this is what I showed one of those other videos. They're going to have a lot of movement at the hip, a lot of forward lean at the trunk, very little movement at the knees and at the ankles. So what you're looking at typically is somebody who is what I call extension dominant, meaning that they'll tend to have an exaggerated extension when they stand normally, right? They'll have more of typically an anterior pelvic tilt that we see. They'll walk with the toes pointed out, or they'll stand with the toes pointed out to the sides. They'll kind of have that exaggerated position, okay? They'll typically squat with their head looking up, so they'll have their toes. We can see this when they squat. These are the ones who are almost like power lifter type squat. They'll have the toes pointed out to the sides. They'll have the chest exaggerated. They'll have the head looking up when they squat. Okay, from the side, what it'll look like, I don't know if my feet are all the way in the camera. It's about the room I've got here. They'll squat like that, right? And they'll have that butt way back. They'll have that excessive forward trunk lean. And what this is, these are typically the individuals who complain of lower back tightness, lower back injuries, potentially even neck problems as well. Okay, so that's typically the extension dominant type. What you're going to see with them is the classic cases of tight lumbar erectors, tight hip flexors, dominant type quadriceps, very weak abdominal complex, weak abdominal stabilization, the whole classic thing. The upper back will tend to be weak. The traps will probably be tight. The levator scapula might be tight, and the sternocleidomastoid will be overactive and potentially tight as well. All right, so those are the classic signs of the extension dominant individual. The flip side of that is the flexion dominant person. So this is the person who will squat, and again, if you watch the hips first, they will tend to squat like this. The hips will posteriorly rotate, so it's almost like they start to move forward. You'll see the hips and the knees moving forward as they start to descend in the squat. So then what happens, you look at the trunk, they'll tend to have more of a rounded trunk position, kind of like that. These are the ones that will have trouble keeping the heels on the ground. The head will tend to look down. So these are the individuals who typically have that upper cross type syndrome, very tight pectoralis muscles, tight internal shoulder rotators. They might have dominance of the rectus abdominis, but at the portion where it attaches to the rib cage, so it's pulling that trunk into flexion. They have poor hip mobility. A lot of times you'll read that there's tightness in the glutes and the hamstrings. Typically what I view it as, and what I've seen, is it's more of a tightness of the hamstrings than anything else. Typically the glutes are weak. And typically as well, glutes are considered phasic muscles, which means that they're not as prone to shortening and tightening. What they're prone to is becoming long and weak. So typically what you'll see is it's the hamstrings, particularly the proximal hamstrings, the attachment to the ischial tuberosity, which posteriorly rotates that pelvis and pulls them forward. All right, so, and that's a big danger because it's showing a dominance of the hamstring muscles. And these are individuals who typically will have trouble pulling hamstrings because they overuse the hamstrings when they run or jump, sprint, or they'll pull it during that part of the phase when they're contracting the muscle, or because the muscles are tight, when they land, the muscle has to stretch and lengthen. So they may tend to, they'll be prone to pulling a hamstring at that end because the hamstrings aren't very flexible, at least not dynamically. So when the eccentric contraction happens and that muscle has to lengthen, like when you land from a jump, or when you're landing at foot contact from a run, from a stride when running, and the muscle has to lengthen, and it can't lengthen properly, it can take repetitive strain from repeatedly having to lengthen more than it's comfortable with until eventually it's that one time that boom, an injury happens, a tear happens, something like that. So those are the two profiles that you're looking at. And I tend to see that if you look at, one of those two profiles, you and your clients will fit into one of those two. They're not going to fit into both. They're going to fit into one primary profile. So it makes it a lot easier to assess a squat when you're looking for just one of two profiles. And then you can better identify what's happening, if they're flexion or extension dominant, and then figure out how to address it. All right? So that is the rack position for the squat. Also, that is some of the common mistakes that you'll see. They're very basic. I know that there are more, but this, I don't want it to go like a half an hour into this video, but I wanted to just give you a very good, very solid assessment base that will apply to most of the clients that you're going to be training. You can identify which one of these two profiles that they fit in, and boom, you're going to fix things really quick for them. All right? So hopefully that helps you out, and that will conclude this portion of the squat assessment.